At 11:40 p.m. on that cursed night, I felt an icy giant pierce the hull. That barely perceptible jolt, a faint scraping sound tearing through the Atlantic silence, and only moments later the chilling truth Thomas Andrews reported to Captain Smith. "Sir, she is doomed. We have no more than 2 hours." It was then, in that split second, that humanity's greatest illusion, my unsinkability, collapsed forever. Prepare yourselves. This is the story that changed everything. I still remember that soul-chilling moment. No, I wasn't there, but I saw it in the eyes of the survivors, felt it in every report, in every piece of debris recovered from the depths. I will tell you how it happened, how the Titanic, the pride of an entire era, became its most tragic symbol. Imagine, the dawn of the 20th century. I witnessed the world stand on the brink of incredible transformations that seemed poised to change human life forever. It was a time filled with audacious dreams of the future, when technological progress opened entirely new horizons before me and millions of others, sparking genuine admiration and excitement. The Industrial Revolution had firmly embedded itself in our daily lives. Electric lighting was gradually replacing gas lamps. Automobiles were starting to supplant horse-drawn carriages, and we, awestruck by technical achievements, strove for new records and ambitious projects. Everything that had seemed impossible just yesterday was becoming a reality right before my eyes. In this transforming world, giant ocean liners held a special place. These astonishing vessels symbolized the full power and grandeur of technological progress. People worldwide followed their construction and launch with bated breath, discussing their size, speed, and unprecedented luxury with enthusiasm. Sea voyages were no longer arduous trials. They became a mark of status, comfort, and success. Ocean liners seemed to embody our human dreams of conquering nature, of the triumph of intellect and engineering over the elements. It was in this atmosphere of universal admiration and anticipation of something grand that the famous liner Titanic was born. She became a true legend even before her maiden voyage, the largest and most luxurious ship ever created by man, who believed that such a majestic vessel simply could not be vulnerable to the forces of nature. But it was this certainty, this blind faith in unsinkability and human grandeur, that made the story of the Titanic particularly tragic and captivating. More than 100 years have passed since that tragic day, when the most famous ship in human history embarked on her maiden and final voyage. But why does the story of the Titanic still evoke such deep interest in me and millions of others? Why are we still fascinated by the details of her construction, her unprecedented luxury, and the fates of her passengers? Perhaps it's because this story isn't just about a ship and a disaster, but about people, about human nature, and about how fragile even the grandest dreams can be. Today, I invite you on a journey that will be full of interesting and moving insights. The story of the Titanic is a story worth hearing to feel, understand, and remember. Make yourselves comfortable, and allow yourselves to be immersed in the atmosphere of this remarkable era. At the very beginning of the 20th century, transatlantic voyages transformed from merely a way to travel from Europe to America into a symbol of progress, prestige, and success. Shipping companies fiercely competed with one another, creating liners of ever-increasing size, speed, and comfort, striving to outdo rivals and win over passengers. One of the most successful companies of that era was the Cunard Line, which owned the liners Lusitania and Mauretania. These two vessels were considered true engineering marvels, capable of crossing the Atlantic at an incredible speed for their time, earning the company the prestigious Blue Ribbon of the Atlantic Award. Cunard Line successfully held a leading position, focusing specifically on the speed of ocean crossings. At the same time, the White Star Line Company chose a completely different audacious strategy. Instead of pursuing speed records, the company's management opted for unprecedented comfort, luxury, and sheer scale in its vessels, aiming to capture the hearts of affluent passengers. The company's head, Joseph Bruce Ismay, and the director of the Harland and Wolff shipyard, William Peary, agreed on the construction of a series of 3 gigantic liners that would embody their creators' boldest ambitions and dreams. These ships were named Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic. The White Star Line entrusted the project's execution to the finest shipyard of its time, located in Belfast, Northern Ireland. The ship's chief designer was the talented and highly respected marine engineer Thomas Andrews. Andrews was more than just an excellent engineer. He possessed an uncanny ability to foresee every minor detail and overlook nothing, however insignificant. It was thanks to his efforts that the Titanic and her sister ships acquired not only magnificent external forms, but also a meticulously designed internal structure. The design of the new liners incorporated the latest engineering achievements of the early 20th century. The Titanic and her sister's construction included a double bottom, a robust steel hull, and a unique system of watertight compartments that divided the ship into 16 independent sections. In theory, it was assumed that even with 4 compartments breached, the ship would not lose buoyancy and could remain afloat long enough for passengers to be evacuated. This innovation was so revolutionary that the press and public began to call the ship virtually unsinkable, although the company never officially used that term. Thomas Andrews personally supervised the construction of each ship, regularly visiting the shipyard, observing the workers, and suggesting numerous minor improvements to ensure maximum safety and comfort for future passengers. Thanks to his tireless attention, the Titanic achieved that astonishing harmony between aesthetics and functionality that made her the most luxurious and majestic ship of her era. First to be launched was the Olympic, the Titanic's older sister. Her successful maiden voyages confirmed the correctness of the chosen approach and gave the company additional confidence in the future. Then came the Titanic's turn. The construction of the giant liner, which began in March 1909, lasted just over 2 years. Its creation required hundreds of thousands of steel plates, over 3 million rivets, and the labor of thousands of workers. The ship's dimensions astonished contemporaries. She was 269 meters long, 28 meters wide, and had a displacement exceeding 46,000 tons. It was a true engineering marvel of its time, eliciting awe and admiration from the public. But despite the splendor and apparent invulnerability of her design, none of her creators could have predicted the tragic fate that awaited the Titanic. At the moment the ship slid down the slipway into the water and began her new life, her future seemed bright and full of triumphs to me. People believed that such magnificence and engineering perfection simply could not be broken by the forces of nature. However, ahead lay a night that would forever alter this certainty and make the Titanic one of the most infamously renowned ships in human history. When the Titanic began construction at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, no one could remain indifferent to what was happening. The ship's construction became a significant event not only for local residents, but for all of Great Britain. More than 3,000 workers toiled daily at the shipyard, manually joining giant steel plates, installing thousands of rivets, and assembling hull components that gradually took on monumental dimensions. The shipyard transformed into a veritable city within a city, where people worked in multiple shifts, and powerful lamps burned throughout the nights, illuminating colossal structures whose height astounded even seasoned builders. To handle these tasks, the most advanced technologies and equipment of their time had to be used. Enormous cranes, hydraulic presses, machines, and mechanisms specially manufactured for working on such a scale. A distinctive feature of the Titanic's design, in addition to her famous watertight bulkheads, was her double bottom, intended to protect her from damage in case of collision with underwater obstacles. Furthermore, the ship was equipped with an emergency compartment closure system from the captain's bridge, allowing damaged sections to be isolated in less than a minute. These were incredibly advanced technical solutions that at the time seemed like a true engineering marvel to me. Finally, once the hull was completed, the most impressive and equally crucial part of the work began: outfitting the liner's interior spaces. The Titanic's interiors were designed not merely to surprise first-class passengers, but to captivate their hearts with luxury and comfort that surpassed anything people were accustomed to seeing on ships. The famous first-class grand staircase leading from the boat deck down to the lavish lounges and restaurants evoked particular admiration. It was crafted from meticulously polished mahogany with exquisite carved ornamentation. At the top of the staircase was a massive glass dome that filled the space with soft, natural light, creating an atmosphere of sophistication and tranquility. Nearby were opulent restaurants, serving exquisite dishes capable of satisfying the most discerning palates. The main first-class restaurant impressed not only with the magnificence of its cuisine, but also with the elegance of its decor: porcelain tableware, gleaming silver cutlery, crystal glasses, and fine tablecloths whose pristine whiteness accentuated the refined ambiance. Worthy of separate mention is the famous smoking room. Designed in the style of a classic British club, the salon's interior was rendered in dark, noble tones. The walls were adorned with mahogany and walnut veneer. Here, passengers gathered in the evenings to discuss news, share impressions, or simply relax with a glass of brandy or a cigar. The first-class reading and writing room was a place of quiet, peaceful relaxation. An atmosphere of complete serenity reigned in this cozy space. Soft armchairs upholstered in green velvet, tables with elegant lamps, and walls adorned with exquisite paintings. Everything here invited reading, contemplation, or unhurried conversation. No less astonishing was the first-class Turkish bath, a true oasis of relaxation. This exotic service for its time included steam rooms, plunge pools with cool water, and massage and relaxation areas. The walls were decorated with Moroccan tiles, mosaics, and stained glass, while subdued lighting contributed to an atmosphere of peace and complete relaxation. For the first time on an ocean liner, there was a gymnasium, equipped with the most modern exercise equipment of the early 20th century. Passengers could maintain their physical fitness even on a long ocean voyage using gymnastic machines, special bicycles, and rowing machines. Thus, the Titanic was not merely a vessel transporting passengers across the Atlantic. She became a symbol of a new era, embodying the ideal of luxury and comfort previously available only on land. People boarding her were immersed in an atmosphere so far removed from the usual realities of sea travel that it seemed magical and almost unreal. But even this luxury and advanced engineering solutions could not prevent the tragedy that would forever etch the Titanic's name into history. While first class on the Titanic was the epitome of luxury and supreme comfort, second class offered passengers coziness, respectable conditions, and amenities considered very generous for the time. Second-class cabins were comfortable, clean, and reasonably spacious, with comfortable beds, small wardrobes, and soft lighting creating a pleasant ambiance. The public spaces were a particular source of pride. Second-class passengers enjoyed a spacious dining saloon offering a diverse and high-quality menu, including several courses, which was a rarity for the middle class on other ships of that era. Additionally, second-class passengers had access to a dedicated lounge with a library, where they could read, play board games, or engage in unhurried conversations over a cup of tea. A separate promenade deck allowed them to enjoy the sea air and ocean views, providing a sense of personal space and comfort rarely available to second-class passengers on other ships. The Titanic's third class was the most modest, but even here, conditions significantly surpassed typical early 20th century standards. Simple, clean, and functional cabins designed for 4 to 6 people were equipped with comfortable bunks, wash basins, and minimal furniture. For many emigrants arriving from impoverished European regions, even these basic amenities were a revelation. Third-class passengers dined in a separate dining saloon, where simple yet nutritious meals prepared from fresh ingredients were served. The third-class general promenade deck was a special place for socializing and recreation. It was there that passengers, including Irish, Swedes, Italians, and Eastern Europeans, often gathered to discuss their hopes and plans for the future. These people were traveling to America not just on a journey, but in search of a better life, stable work, and new opportunities. They had left behind family, friends, and their former lives in their homelands, dreaming of starting anew across the ocean. Among the Titanic's passengers were many famous and notable individuals whose fates became symbols of the tragedy and heroism of that night. One of the most renowned and dramatic is the story of John Jacob Astor IV, a multimillionaire, one of the wealthiest men of his time. Traveling with his young, pregnant wife, Astor refused to take a place in a lifeboat until he was sure his wife was safe. His actions, composure, and dignity became for me a symbol of true gentlemanly conduct. No less famous is the story of Margaret Brown, who became known as the Unsinkable Molly Brown. A woman of strong character, wealthy and independent. On the night of the disaster, she displayed extraordinary courage and vigor. While in a lifeboat, She organized aid for survivors, encouraged other passengers, and actively advocated for the lifeboat to return and pick up those left in the icy water. After the tragedy, she became one of the most prominent advocates for passenger rights and campaigned for increased maritime safety. Another distinguished passenger, billionaire and philanthropist Benjamin Guggenheim, also displayed incredible dignity. Understanding that the ship was sinking and there was no salvation, Guggenheim changed into an elegant evening suit and, accompanied by his valet, went to the lounge, declaring his intention to meet his fate like a true gentleman. Another poignant story is connected to the Goodwin family, Frederick and Augusta, and their 6 children. The family was en route to America in search of a new life. However, none of the members of this large family survived. Their tragic fate became a symbol of many similar stories of emigrants who traveled towards a dream but never reached the new shore. These destinies, intertwined with the Titanic's story, made the disaster not just a technical tragedy, but a human drama in which both the best qualities of human nature, courage, self-sacrifice, honor, and dreams that remained unfulfilled in the cold expanse of the Atlantic were revealed. It is these personal, vivid stories that still continue to deeply move me and others, prompting reflection on how fragile our hopes and aspirations are in the face of unpredictable destiny. On April 10, 1912, a special atmosphere permeated the port city of Southampton on England's southern coast. The morning was crisp, with a light mist over the sea, and the air was filled with anticipation of a momentous event. On this day, the largest and most luxurious liner of its time, the Titanic, was embarking on her maiden voyage across the Atlantic to New York. Hundreds of people gathered at the pier: passengers, their families and loved ones, journalists, and ordinary townspeople who wanted to catch even a glimpse of this splendor. From everywhere came the buzz of voices, the cries of seagulls, the signals of other ships, and the rumble of carriage wheels delivering luggage aboard the liner. On the decks, the crew hastily completed final preparations, checking every detail and stowing passengers' luggage, ensuring everything was perfectly ready for departure. First-class passengers ascended the gangways calmly and confidently, accompanied by stewards and assistants, carrying themselves with dignity and a hidden thrill of the journey ahead. Families of second- and third-class passengers bustled and tried not to lose each other in the crowd, clutching their tickets and personal belongings tightly. Among them were those embarking on dreams and a new life, and those traveling for business on vacation or due to family matters. Precisely at noon, a loud and deep blast sounded, symbolizing the commencement of the great voyage. Gradually, the giant liner began to move slowly away from the pier. People on shore waved their hands, handkerchiefs, and hats, shouting wishes of good luck and fair winds. Aboard the Titanic, many passengers came out onto the deck to watch those seeing them off, and cast a final glance at the English shore, unaware that this would be the last farewell for many of them. That same evening, the Titanic made her first brief stop in the port city of Cherbourg, on the northern coast of France. The port proved not deep enough for such an enormous vessel, so passengers reached the ship via special tender boats. In Cherbourg, new passengers boarded, including affluent Europeans and Americans traveling for business or vacationing in Europe. In total, just over 200 passengers boarded the Titanic in Cherbourg, among whom were many prominent names. The liner then continued her journey, heading towards Ireland. Already on the morning of April 11th, she arrived in Queenstown. Today, this city is known as Cobh. Here, the last passengers boarded, mostly Irish emigrants heading across the ocean with hopes for a better life. The atmosphere in the port was quite different from Southampton or Cherbourg. Here there was more excitement, more hope, and perhaps more sadness. Many passengers understood that they would never return home. After a brief stop in Queenstown, the Titanic left Europe and set a course west, heading across the Atlantic Ocean towards the American shore. Aboard, an atmosphere of calm and measured routine gradually settled in. Passengers settled into their cabins, met each other, strolled the decks, and became accustomed to the ship, unaware that an event lay ahead which would forever change the history of seafaring and remain etched in humanity's memory for eternity. After departing Queenstown, a pleasant, unhurried atmosphere of ocean travel settled aboard the Titanic. The sea was remarkably calm. The weather was clear, almost windless, and the enormous ship gracefully and majestically cut through the Atlantic waters, heading west. For most passengers, the first days of the voyage were a time of serenity and pleasure. Evenings in first class were particularly luxurious and unhurried. After dinner in the exquisite restaurant, passengers gathered in the lounges, where calm conversations, jokes, and laughter mingled with the soft music of the orchestra. At such moments, it seemed the world around was beautiful and stable, and the ocean voyage transformed into an unforgettable celebration of life. Gentlemen frequented the smoking room, where they discussed the latest news, while ladies spent time in the opulent reception room, socializing and relaxing from the day's concerns. On the open decks in the evening, passengers could be seen strolling in pairs or small groups, enjoying the sea air and the Atlantic's tranquility. Many gazed west, contemplating what awaited them in New York. Some were heading for family reunions. Others dreamed of new business opportunities or simply of a vacation. Among third-class passengers on the decks, conversations were more emotional and excited. Here, words about a new life, work, and hopes for the future in America were more frequently heard. However, as the night of April 14, 1912 approached, the situation gradually began to change. That morning began as usual: clear weather, a smooth sea surface, and a measured pace of life on board. Passengers, unsuspecting, ate breakfast, strolled, and enjoyed the comfort. Meanwhile, warnings were reaching the captain's bridge from other ships crossing the North Atlantic about icebergs sighted in the area. Such warnings were common practice for transatlantic voyages and were not taken too alarmingly at the time. Captain Edward J. Smith and his officers, experienced seamen, were confident they could detect and avoid any obstacles in the ship's path in time. Throughout the day, the crew received at least 6 messages from ships warning of ice fields and individual icebergs ahead on their course. But a confident calm prevailed on the Titanic. It seemed nothing could disturb her majestic journey. Some warnings were delivered to the bridge, others were ignored or set aside for later consideration. The primary reason for this inattention lay in the absolute confidence of the crew and passengers in the Titanic's safety and reliability. This confidence was further bolstered by the unusually calm sea and good weather, creating a false sense of security. As dusk settled, the air temperature noticeably dropped, and passengers strolling the decks began to notice the chill and a starry sky of incredible clarity. It was quiet and calm. A magnificent dinner was held in the first-class dining room, after which passengers slowly dispersed to their cabins or went to the lounges and smoking rooms to spend the evening in the company of friends and new acquaintances. Captain Smith briefly came to the bridge to ensure everything was in order, and after a short conversation with his officers, retired for the night, leaving instructions to be immediately roused at the slightest sign of danger. At 11 p.m., when most passengers were already in their cabins or quietly relaxing in the lounges, the liner continued to speed into the night at almost full speed, about 22 knots. On the bridge, First Officer William Murdoch and Sixth Officer James Moody were on duty, carefully watching the horizon. At the same time, lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, stationed in the crow's nest, peered intently into the ocean's darkness, as yet seeing nothing. The ship confidently sailed towards her tragic fate, and no one yet suspected how dramatically the lives of everyone on board would change in just a few minutes. The clocks aboard the Titanic showed 11:40 p.m. when the night was suddenly pierced by the urgent ringing of the bell in the crow's nest. Frederick Fleet was the first to spot the dark silhouette of a massive iceberg looming directly ahead of the ship. He immediately rang the bell and telephoned the bridge with a short but ominous phrase, "Iceberg right ahead," on the bridge. Decisive action began instantly. First Officer William Murdoch promptly gave the helmsman the order, "Hard a starboard," simultaneously ordering to stop the engines and put them full astern. But the massive liner, weighing tens of thousands of tons and traveling at high speed, proved too unwieldy. The vessel began to turn slowly, but there was no longer enough time to avoid a collision. The iceberg slowly scraped along the starboard side. Its massive icy protrusions with a horrific grinding sound gouged the steel hull, creating a long series of small but fatally dangerous gashes. For the passengers inside, the collision was barely noticeable. Many felt only a slight jolt and heard a muffled sound. Some noticed nothing at all and continued to relax calmly, unaware that anything serious had occurred. On the Titanic's bridge and in her lower compartments, however, The situation looked entirely different. Captain Edward John Smith, immediately summoned to the bridge, quickly assessed the seriousness of what had happened. He immediately dispatched Chief Designer Thomas Andrews and several officers to inspect the damage in the lower compartments. The team quickly descended and found that cold seawater was rapidly filling the compartments. Soon after the initial inspections, Thomas Andrews grasped the terrible truth. Too many compartments were damaged, more than 4, which meant the liner's inevitable demise. A difficult yet composed conversation took place on the bridge between Captain Smith and Andrews. Thomas Andrews informed the captain that the Titanic was doomed, and they had no more than 2 hours to evacuate the passengers. The realization of the catastrophe was a heavy blow to Captain Smith, but he maintained his composure and immediately ordered the lifeboats to be prepared and the passenger evacuation to begin. Meanwhile, complete calm reigned on the upper decks. Initially, passengers received the news of the Iceberg collision without much alarm. Many continued to play cards, listen to music, or rest in their cabins. Believing it was merely a minor incident, the ship's crew made every effort not to cause panic, reassuring passengers and telling them there was no danger. Gradually, however, the situation began to change. People began to notice the ship tilting slightly forward and to starboard. Third-class passengers, agitated and anxious, began to emerge from the lower decks, having been the first to sense something was wrong as water started flooding their cabins. Tension gradually mounted on the decks. Passengers started gathering and questioning crew members. Some began putting on life jackets. First-class passengers perceived the events more calmly, deeming it impossible that such a huge and reliable ship could truly be in serious danger. But as the crew began preparing the lifeboats for launch, and commands grew increasingly insistent, passengers started to grasp the reality of the situation. Nevertheless, there was no panic yet. Rather, a general uncertainty and apprehension prevailed. The Titanic's orchestra began to play calming music, striving to reassure passengers and prevent panic from spreading. Stewards and officers moved among the passengers, soothing them and helping them prepare for evacuation. At this time, most aboard still hoped that everything would turn out all right. But calm gradually gave way to anxiety, and the realization that the ship was indeed sinking. Time was running out, and the passengers, who had only recently been enjoying luxury and comfort, now stood on the decks in bewilderment, realizing that this night would be the most terrifying and significant of their lives. When the crew finally grasped the inevitability of the Titanic's demise, the passenger evacuation began on the upper decks. The situation was compounded by the critically insufficient number of lifeboats on board. According to the regulations in force at the time, the number of lifeboats depended not on the number of passengers, but on the size of the vessel. No one had anticipated that such a massive liner could sink so quickly. As a result, there were only 20 lifeboats on board, enough for approximately half of all passengers and crew members. The crew began preparing the lifeboats for lowering around midnight. Evacuation prioritized women and children. Officers on the decks meticulously ensured order, striving to prevent panic. But even at this critical moment, many passengers and crew members could not believe the vessel was doomed. Because of this, many lifeboats left the Titanic half empty. People simply refused to get into them, not believing that the ship was truly sinking. Soon, the decks began to fill with passengers from the lower compartments, including many immigrant families. Anxiety and confusion reigned in the passageways. Third-class passengers faced difficulties trying to reach the lifeboats through a labyrinth of corridors and stairways, and crew members were sometimes unable to assist them due to strict rules restricting free movement between decks of different classes. Amidst this anxious commotion, the heroic deeds of the officers and crew members particularly stood out. For instance, First Officer William Murdoch maintained calm and composure until the very end, personally helping passengers into lifeboats and ensuring order. Second Officer Charles Lightoller also behaved heroically, clearly and decisively directing the evacuation. Moreover, later, finding himself in the icy water, he miraculously survived by clambering onto an overturned lifeboat. The heroic act of Captain Edward John Smith is also unforgettable. Understanding that his ship was doomed, the captain refused to leave the vessel. He remained on the bridge until the last moment, supporting the crew and passengers, and met his fate with dignity, going down with his ship into the icy Atlantic. Particularly poignant and unforgettable for me remains the act of the Titanic's musicians. Under the direction of bandleader Wallace Hartley, the orchestra played calming melodies to soothe passengers and prevent panic. The musicians did not stop playing even when the lifeboats had been lowered, and it became clear that there was almost no chance of rescue left. Their final melody played even as the decks tilted so steeply that standing became virtually impossible. Their heroic act forever remains in humanity's memory as an example of incredible courage and self-sacrifice. No less moving were the fates of the ordinary crew members, stewards, stokers, engineers, and other workers. Many of them consciously gave their life jackets to passengers and continued to perform their duties until the last minutes. Engineers and stokers in the engine rooms worked without pause, maintaining the pumps and lighting on the ship. Almost all of them perished, remaining at their posts until the end. Each lifeboat, pulling away from the side, slowly drifted into the Atlantic darkness, leaving behind a ship filled with tragedy and heroism. Those in the lifeboats, looking back at the Titanic, already clearly understood the full scale of the disaster, but were powerless to help those who remained on the decks. On this night, both the brightest and most tragic aspects of human nature emerged. Self-sacrifice, courage, and compassion confronted despair and fear. The Titanic, the pride of her time and a symbol of human hopes, slowly slipped beneath the waves, taking with her the lives and destinies of hundreds of people. The story of the Titanic is not just the story of a ship and a disaster. It is the story of the fates of hundreds of people who faced the most agonizing choices. Stories in which courage, love, and self-sacrifice were intertwined. One of the most poignant was the fate of Isidore and Ida Strauss, a married couple. The elderly couple, who had lived a long and happy life, were traveling in first class. When the moment of evacuation arrived, Ida was offered a place in a lifeboat. However, she refused to leave her husband. Isidore urged her to save herself. But Ida was unyielding, uttering the famous phrase, "We have lived together for a long time, and I will stay with you until the end." They were last seen standing on the deck holding hands tightly, calmly accepting their fate. No less poignant is the story of the Allison family, who were traveling with 2 young children in first class. In the chaos of the evacuation, the parents lost their elder daughter Lorraine and, frantically searching for her, refused to board a lifeboat. The girl had by then already been saved by her nanny, a fact her parents never learned. The Allisons remained on board until the last moment, searching for their child. Tragic was the fate of the newlyweds John and Marion Thayer. John Thayer managed to help his wife into a lifeboat and remained on board with their son, teenager Jack. When the ship sank, Jack managed to survive by clinging to debris. His father, however, despite all efforts, perished. Marion remained unaware of her husband's and son's fates all night until she reunited with her surviving son aboard the Carpathia the next morning. Also forever etched in memory is the story of the Goodwin family parents and their 6 children. They were traveling in third class, seeking a new life in America. None of the family members survived, and days after the disaster, the ocean washed ashore the body of the youngest child, Sidney Goodwin. The boy was buried as an unknown child, and only many years later was his identity established through DNA testing. His fate became a symbol of many tragedies of emigrants who embarked on a dream but never reached the shore. By dawn on April 15th, the surviving passengers in the lifeboats amidst the icy Atlantic had already lost hope of rescue. But around 4 a.m., lights appeared in the distance. It was the steamship Carpathia, which had received the distress signal and immediately headed to the rescue, cutting through dangerous ice fields at maximum speed. As the lifeboats with frozen and distraught passengers began to be brought aboard the Carpathia, the crew did everything to alleviate their suffering. Survivors were immediately offered hot drinks, warm blankets, medical assistance, and dry clothing. The Carpathia's passengers and crew voluntarily gave up their cabins to accommodate the rescued, displaying compassion and humanity that forever remained in the memories of eyewitnesses. Aboard the Carpathia, an atmosphere of both relief and sorrow prevailed. People searched for their loved ones, hoping they had survived. Many, failing to find their relatives among the rescued, experienced bitter moments of loss realization. The stories heard aboard the rescue liner were later recorded and recounted to the world, striking with the depth of human fates and emotions. The Carpathia's journey to New York took several days, and when the ship finally approached the pier on April 18th, thousands of people gathered to meet the surviving Titanic passengers. The city plunged into mourning, and the story of the disaster instantly spread worldwide, leaving a profound mark on humanity's memory forever. The night was drawing to its dramatic close. Time slowly advanced towards 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912. By this point, the Titanic, that majestic liner, a symbol of human pride and progress, had already significantly dipped her bow beneath the water. Her stern slowly and relentlessly rose into the air. Hundreds of passengers and crew members remaining on the decks watched what was happening with quiet resignation, realizing they could not escape their fate. There was no longer any panic on board. Instead, a strange silence reigned, broken only by rare cries and the sounds of the ship sinking beneath the waves. People clung to railings, trying to maintain their balance on the slanting decks. Some prayed quietly, others held hands, saying goodbye without words. In these final moments, when everyone understood that there would be no more rescue, the full depth and strength of the human spirit became evident on the liner's decks. Captain Smith stepped onto the bridge one last time, gazed at the ocean and quietly vanished, forever becoming part of his ship's legend. At these same moments, the musicians, led by Wallace Hartley, completed their final piece. Their music faded, giving way to the dull roar and groaning of metal that accompanied the liner's final moments. The Titanic's stern, rising high above the water, paused for a moment, as if attempting to resist the inevitable. Then the hull could no longer withstand the strain and broke in two with a horrific booming sound. The forward section of the vessel quickly vanished beneath the water, pulling down those who remained on the decks. The stern held vertically for a few more minutes, as if bidding farewell to the world, then slowly and irreversibly disappeared beneath the waves. The ocean's surface once again became smooth and silent, as if nothing had ever happened. After the ship finally sank, only debris, life jackets, and people trying to stay afloat remained in the icy darkness of the Atlantic, awaiting help that for most never came. The ocean's silence became the final memory for those who could not be saved. For the few who were brought aboard the Carpathia, life was changed forever. They survived, but their fates were fraught with heavy memories and complex emotional struggles. Many of the rescued felt guilt throughout their lives toward the deceased, wondering why they had survived while others remained forever in the cold waters of the Atlantic. Molly Brown, the Unsinkable woman, dedicated the rest of her life to helping the tragedy's victims and their families. She organized charity events and strove to improve safety conditions on ships. Young Milvina Dean, who was only 2 months old during the sinking, became the last living witness to the tragedy, dying almost a century later in 2009. Throughout her life, she spoke to the world about the events of that night, reminding humanity of the importance of remembrance and compassion. John Thayer's son Jack, one of the few men who survived the Titanic's sinking, later described the tragic events in his memoirs, which became a valuable historical source. But the memory of what he endured always remained a heavy burden that accompanied him throughout his life. Memories of what was experienced aboard the Titanic profoundly and irreversibly changed the fates of many people. Surviving passengers and crew members, despite the pain of loss, found the strength to continue living, becoming for the world living testaments not only to the tragedy, but also to the astonishing capacity of the human spirit to overcome even the most arduous trials. The Titanic forever remained a symbol of both pride and tragedy, of courage and powerlessness before the forces of nature, and as long as humanity remembers this story, it will be a reminder of how fragile life can be, and how important it is to cherish every moment of it, which will always be fragile and priceless. Immediately after the rescued passengers arrived in New York, extensive investigations into the disaster began. The public and authorities demanded an answer to the question, how could this have happened to the largest, most luxurious, and technically advanced vessel of its time? Almost simultaneously, 2 major official inquiries were conducted, British and American. These commissions interviewed hundreds of eyewitnesses, passengers, crew members, and rescuers, attempting to reconstruct every minute of the events. As a result, it became clear that the causes of the disaster were complex: excessive confidence in the ship's safety, disregard for iceberg warnings, an insufficient number of lifeboats, crew errors, and the imperfect safety regulations of the era. Following the conclusion of the investigations, significant changes were made to maritime rules and standards. The most crucial decision was the mandatory requirement to provide lifeboat spaces for all passengers and crew members without exception. 24-hour radio watch was mandated on ships, so that every distress signal would be heard in time. Furthermore, new routes for ocean liners were developed to avoid areas particularly hazardous due to ice fields and icebergs. It became mandatory to conduct drills and passenger evacuation exercises, and shipping regulations were tightened to ensure such a tragedy would never recur. However, the disaster's impact extended far beyond just maritime navigation and safety. The Titanic tragedy quickly permeated mass consciousness, becoming one of the greatest and most symbolic disasters in human history. The liner's story became the subject of numerous books, plays, films, exhibitions, and even musical compositions. Over the years, the legend of the Titanic acquired almost mythological characteristics, becoming a symbol of human vulnerability in the face of the elements and a reminder of how fragile our most confident expectations can be. James Cameron's famous 1997 film not only reignited interest in the tragedy, but also breathed new life into it, making the Titanic story a part of modern popular culture. Millions of people re-experience those tragic events through the fates of fictional and real heroes portrayed on screen. But why does the story of the Titanic continue to resonate with me and others so many years later? Perhaps it is because this tragedy forces us to contemplate the depth and complexity of human nature, the courage and self-sacrifice shown in the face of inevitability, or perhaps because the Titanic's fate reflected all human hopes, fears, and illusions that we experience when trying to conquer the world around us. Today, the Titanic rests at a depth of almost 4 kilometers in the cold darkness of the Atlantic, slowly deteriorating under the influence of time and the ocean. But her memory lives on, strong, reminding us how important it is to remember the lessons of the past and to cherish every fragile and priceless moment.